If you are reading this and assuming that calling 999 tonight guarantees your safety, you are operating on a dangerously outdated assumption. As an analyst who has spent 25 years monitoring state infrastructure, I usually reserve the terminology I am about to use for failing regimes or conflict zones. But today, the data emerging from the Nuffield Trust allows for no other conclusion. Britain's emergency medical shield has not just cracked, it has suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The figures hitting my desk this morning are not merely worrying, they are chilling. We are witnessing a historic exodus. More than 40,000 qualified nurses have severed ties with the NHS. That is 11.5% of the total workforce vanishing into thin air. In geopolitical terms, this is the equivalent of an army losing a tenth of its soldiers before a battle has even commenced. This is not attrition, this is an evacuation. But the true horror lies in the immediate operational fallout. In a single, terrifying 24-hour window, 61 emergency zones across England were officially downgraded. For the uninitiated, downgraded is bureaucratic shorthand for collapsed. It means the safety net in those areas was removed. As a result, 5,700 Category 1 calls, these are life or death scenarios, cardiac arrests, catastrophic bleeds, were rerouted. Imagine the panic of a dispatcher trying to find a heartbeat on a map that has gone dark. Response times in some regions have now stretched to nearly triple the national target. This week, the British emergency system ceased to function as a national service and evolved into a postcode lottery of survival. For months, ambulance crews have been sounding the alarm. They warned that the pressure was rising, that the violence was escalating, and that the system was too fragile to hold. Ministers insisted everything was stable. They lied. The system didn't just bend under the strain, it buckled entirely. And as we peel back the layers of this crisis, we find that this isn't just about wages or rotas. It is about something far more sinister spreading through our streets. A pattern of hostility that has turned routine call-outs into high-risk operations. The numbers tell us the system is broken. What comes next explains why. If the collapse of the data in Part 1 was alarming, the reality on the asphalt is terrifying. As a veteran observer of civil unrest, I look for a specific tipping point, the moment when the authority of the state is physically contested on its own territory. That moment has arrived. For the first time in domestic reporting, we are seeing the military-grade term, hostile perimeter, appearing in routine ambulance logs, a phrase historically reserved for riot control or counter-terror operations, not weekday medical emergencies. The narrative emerging from the ground is no longer about medicine, it is about territory and control. The breaking point didn't arrive with a bang, but with a chilling silence in South Manchester. A paramedic crew, responding to a routine chest pain call, found themselves stalled behind a crowd outside a disputed migrant housing block. This was not a traffic jam. It was a blockade. Residents argued, shouted, and refused to yield, even after the sirens were activated. The ambulance sat impotent, its lights reflecting off a wall of people who simply did not care. By the time police units cleared a path, the patient was being moved by neighbors, a risky, desperate intervention that signals the total failure of the system. 2 hours later, a similar pattern erupted in East London. A crew attempting to reach a stabbing victim, a Category 1 emergency, was physically hemmed in by a brawl spilling onto the road. Bystanders weren't helping, they were filming, shouting, and obstructing the vehicle. The dispatcher logged the phrase, "scene unsafe." That designation, once rare, is now appearing in reports across the country with unsettling frequency. Senior emergency planners, speaking behind closed doors, describe this as a complete breakdown of social boundaries. The fundamental assumption of emergency work, that the public will step aside to let you save a life, has evaporated in these flashpoints. In Birmingham and Leicester, crews are reporting being followed, blocked, or surrounded. One internal briefing put it in brutally simple terms: we are losing safe access to parts of our own cities. This is no longer a service, it is a siege. When an ambulance cannot reach a front door without a police escort, we are not looking at a healthcare crisis. We are looking at lawless enclaves, where the writ of the British state no longer runs. The streets have become a contested zone, and right now, the NHS is losing the ground war. The physical obstruction of our streets, described in my previous dispatch, has triggered something far more corrosive: the total psychological collapse of the frontline workforce. In conflict zones, we call this combat fatigue. In the NHS, they are calling it the new normal. The most alarming shift revealed in this week's data is not logistical, it is deeply, dangerously psychological. For the first time in the history of the service, British paramedics are beginning to view the 999 call not as a cry for help, but as a potential ambush. The neutral medic, that sacred idea that an ambulance crew is safe anywhere because they are there to heal, is dead. It has been killed by a rising tide of hostility that views the uniform of a paramedic with the same disdain as the uniform of a riot officer. Inside local command hubs from Leeds to Croydon, the atmosphere is toxic with fear. Leaked correspondence from emergency dispatchers reveals a workforce that is overwhelmed, frightened, and openly questioning whether the government has any grip on reality. The standard operating procedure has fundamentally shifted. Dispatch supervisors are no longer asking the critical medical question: how fast can we get there? They are hesitating, paralyzed by a new, darker question: is it even safe to send them? This hesitation is deadly. It is known as tactical delay, and it costs lives. In Birmingham, bodycam footage, now circulating internally, shows a paramedic forced to retreat into his vehicle as a crowd pressed forward, believing he was assisting the wrong side of an altercation. In Leicester, a crew had to shelter inside their ambulance for 10 minutes, listening to the thud of fists against the panels, waiting for police backup while their patient waited for care. When frontline medics start factoring in their own survival before they step out of the vehicle, the emergency system enters an existential crisis. One senior dispatcher in the West Midlands summarized the horror in a leaked call: half our incidents aren't medical emergencies anymore. They are security risks with medical symptoms attached. The psychological contract between the state and its servants has been severed. These men and women did not sign up to be soldiers, yet they are being forced to navigate a battlefield, unarmed and unprotected, in the heart of Britain. If the situation on the streets is volatile, the reaction in Westminster is clinically detached. There is a widening, dangerous chasm between the polished rhetoric of Whitehall and the brutal reality on the asphalt. As an analyst, I have seen governments deny crises before, but rarely with such brazen confidence. While 61 zones were collapsing, government spokespersons were on television repeating the same rehearsed adjectives: resilient, stable, under evaluation. These words are not just inaccurate, they are an insult to the intelligence of the British public. Inside the operations rooms, resilient is not the word being used. The internal logs are filled with descriptors like compounded degradation, unsustainable, and unpredictable. One exhausted operations manager, after a 17-hour shift, was recorded stating, "We're patching holes faster than we can count them." Yet, the government treats this merely as a staffing dispute, a numbers game to be managed with budgets and rotas. They are fundamentally misdiagnosing the disease. A senior insider, speaking off the record, cut through the political varnish with a single, devastating sentence: "Ministers think this is a staffing dispute. It isn't. It's a public order crisis wearing a medical uniform." The most damning evidence of this disconnect is the suppression of intelligence. Earlier this week, an internal Home Office analysis explicitly warned that environmental volatility, a euphemism for rising social tension linked to unverified arrivals and overcrowded housing, had begun overwhelming service routes in 5 major cities. The report recommended immediate reassessments of risk zones. Did the Prime Minister address this? Did the Home Secretary warn the public? No. The recommendations were buried. Advisors urged the Prime Minister to address the nation. He declined. The calculation was cynical but clear. To acknowledge the scale of the breakdown would be to invite questions his government is not prepared to answer. Questions like, why were warnings about rising hostility ignored for a year? Why is the government insisting the system is stable when those running it say it is hours away from a structural breach? Westminster is reacting to a crisis it assumed it could manage from a spreadsheet. But you cannot regulate chaos, and you cannot legislate for a loss of control. The government is currently managing a blind spot that threatens to widen into a full-scale political liability. They are pretending the fire isn't burning, even as the smoke fills the room. We have examined the data, the streets, the psychology, and the politics. Now, we must confront the final, darker implication of these reports, the question that haunts every analyst looking at a failing system. What happens when the safety net itself is too afraid to be deployed? The breaking point arrived quietly. It wasn't a singular explosion, but a gradual breakdown of social boundaries. The internal dashboard flashing red at ambulance command is not just a metric. It is a warning light for the nation's stability. Senior planners describe the current state as compounded degradation. In layman's terms, this is a death spiral. Every hour of disruption compounds the next. When a crew is stuck in a standoff for 2 hours, the queue of unanswered calls grows, the pressure on remaining units intensifies, and the system begins to consume its own resources just to survive. We are witnessing the end of the golden hour, that critical window where emergency intervention guarantees survival. It is being replaced by the negotiated hour, where police availability and crowd temperament dictate whether a patient lives or dies. This leads us to the ultimate question, one that Westminster seems terrified to ask. If the people trained to save us cannot move freely through Britain's cities, what does that imply for the safety of the ordinary citizen? If a paramedic in a high-visibility uniform and a protected vehicle is vulnerable, the pedestrian on the pavement stands no chance. The government says the situation is under control. The people running the crisis say the opposite. As the gap between those two realities widens, Britain is left standing on uncertain ground. Stability does not vanish overnight, it erodes slowly, through moments just like these. The walkouts may eventually end. The headlines may fade. But the warning they delivered will not. We have seen the cracks in the foundation, and they are running straight through the spine of the state. As I file this report, the official line remains one of temporary strain. But speak to any medic who worked the night shift in Manchester, London, or Birmingham, and they will tell you the truth. We didn't lose control of the streets overnight. We just finally admitted we never had it. The NHS is not just facing a winter crisis. It is facing a crisis of sovereignty over the streets it serves. A country cannot function when its emergency workers feel unsafe, its communities feel unheard, and its leaders seem more focused on narrative than reality. Tonight, Britain faces a new reality. The blue lights are flickering. The question is, will they stay on? Do you believe Britain's emergency system is still strong? Or is this the first sign of something deeper breaking beneath the surface? I will be reading the comments below. Your voice matters in this debate.